is what does globalization mean for non-territorial autonomy? Can we still have non-territorial autonomy with all these processes of globalization? And my perspective is a perspective of philosophy and ethics, political theory. So please, the next slide. So if we say what is NTA in the process of globalization, you see at the slides, I'd say that my contribution deals with the elements of hermeneutics and cultural difference and intercultural dialogue in order to find ways of protecting non-territorial autonomy in the process of globalization. So the idea is we have the challenge of globalization, and how can we defend the culture, particular culture? We talk about biodiversity about nature, the destruction of biodiversity, but we also have at the level of human beings the destruction of cultures and the languages that don't exist anymore, and this uniformization of the world. So the key words are world culture, non-territorial autonomy in terms of culture, clash of civilizations. A huge challenge is a clash of civilization with regard to protection of culture. And this, of course, leads to the question of cultural difference and respect for the other. What is a concept of toleration in a process of world culture, the development of world culture? Please, the next slide. So there's a discussion of the development of world culture. What is world culture? It means that we actually refer more and more to common events at a global scale. You can, for example, take the Olympics. You can mention World Championship of football. You have media that are globalized and so on. So you can say what happens to cultural encounters and protection of the difference of culture where we have this emergence of one world. This is French philosopher and sociologist Gilles Lipovetsky, who talks about the concept of one world. What you can say about the concept of one world is it's driven by neoliberal capitalism and the global economy, so to say, where you have, for example, the brands are examples of world culture. But with world culture, we also have an increasing clash of civilizations. I think we see it a lot at this moment, how different cultural groups in a way want to defend some fundamental values. Next slide. So what I propose from a perspective of philosophy of hermeneutics is, of course, an idea of interpretation of culture, interpretation of the values of culture. When you have different cultures, you need to go into dialogue. And this is important as an alternative to the clash of civilization. This is really the idea of communication. So what is cultural dialogue as an alternative to clash of civilization? As you see at the slide, I talk about everyday conversation and interaction, intellectual cultural education, the listening dialogue based on education, and intense conversation between cultures based on mutual recognition of language and history. I think that's what we need. We need to be open to the other culture. And I think an essential element of non-territorial autonomy is exactly this openness to the respect for the culture of the other. And of course, what does this mean in practice? That's a big challenge. Please, the next slide. So you can say what is important for non-territorial autonomy from the perspective of culture is to develop this concept of an intercultural encounter. So I think we need to find out what is intercultural encounter. It is cultural dialogue in contrast to cultural uniformization. So concretely, we need to work on the values and recognition of the important values of each culture. Please. But of course, when we talk about one world and world culture, we have this problem of the hegemony of world culture. The hegemony of world culture is, as I said, the domination of the brands. And I think world culture is strange because it creates a common reference for humanity, but at the same time it destroys the particularity of each culture. I think world culture also, which may be good, it gives the individual an element to possibility to leave one's own culture and move beyond your culture towards something universal. On the other hand, with world culture, we may ask, as I've written in the slide, we may ask what is the future of cultural difference? We need to refine and respect difference of particular cultures in this movement towards world culture. So there's world culture, but there's also respect for the individuality and particularity of each individual culture. So next slide. And here is a philosopher. I worked on the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and he has this interesting book on cosmopolitanism, and here you say forgiveness. It implies also cosmopolitanism and hospitality. The idea of cosmopolitanism is also linked to the respect for the refugee, respect for the people who is thrown out of a culture. And when Derrida talks about cosmopolitanism, he talks about the city. It comes polis, cosmos and polis. And the city, if you look at the cities throughout the world, they are a bricolage of cultures. And you have in the city, you meet the other. You also in the cities, you see different cultures coexisting. And the city should be open for the refugee. When the book was written in 1997, it was a question of hosting writers from countries where they had to flee because of political conditions. So he linked the concept of cosmopolitanism with the concept of hospitality. So hospitality becomes the openness to the culture of the other, the willingness to accommodate the other as other with the other's particular culture. So that's this concept of hospitality. And I think if we want to give meaning to cultural encounter today, we need to look at this idea of unconditional hospitality. Unconditional hospitality means to open up for the culture of the other. And as you see at this slide, I open myself to the other in my home, my house, my language, my culture, and my nation. Such unconditional hospitality is a transgression that seems to go beyond the Kantian concept of hospitality. It's because Derrida followed up on the German philosopher Kant, and Kant said we should all be cosmopolitan, in the sense we should care for global problems, we should travel, but we should also leave again. When you visit somebody, you should not stay too long. You should leave and go home. And with this concept of Derrida, you move a bit beyond the Kantian concept of cosmopolitanism, because you care for global problems, but you are also open for the otherness of the other to accommodate the values of the other. So this is this idea of hospitality, which becomes an ethics, a fundamental ethics of openness. And hospitality is such the openness to the other. It becomes a fundamental ethical principle of respect for cultural difference in the context of NTA, in a world with the danger of the hegemony of world culture. So hospitality operates between respect for the particularity of culture, cosmopolitanism, and the danger of the hegemony of world culture. Please, the next slide. So this was Derrida, and I really like this idea of cosmopolitanism based on the openness towards the other. But I recently became aware that there's so much focus in our society on, at least in philosophy and humanities, we talk a lot about post-colonialism today. And I think that maybe that is very idealistic, but if we want to understand the hegemony of world culture, we should look to this concept of post-colonial theory. Post-colonial theory and protecting of minorities' linguistic, educational, and cultural rights is a challenge to that concept of unconditional hospitality. It's both philosophers from France, and it's interesting to say what was before Derrida. This was Sartre and Frantz Fanon. And Derrida opened for a new perspective. But in a sense, now we are going back to the philosophers before Derrida, because there's so much criticism of the reduction of the power and oppression of cultural minorities. So that's why I go back to Sartre, the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and his book from 1960 is a huge example of what happens when societies are destroyed by power. Actually, he tells a story, there you have some very difficult concept, but he tells a story about how a revolution always turns into a tyranny, and you need a new revolution. And the example is, for example, the Russian Revolution. You start in 1917 with the revolution, and then 20 years later, you end with the ghost of Stalin as the institutionalization of power. And then you have a new revolution, sometimes go, and you have a new institutionalization of power. That is Sartre's conception, and then you go on to his pupil, Frantz Fanon, who studied colonialism on the basis of Sartre's philosophy and analyzed the problems of racism and oppression. In this book, for example, The West of the Earth. And I have a colleague, Robert Bernasconi, from Memphis in the United States, who is British, who moved to the United States, who follows up on this discussion of how Sartre's concept, you find this in Frantz Fanon. And I think in order to understand the problems or the challenges of protecting cultures today, we can learn something from this perspective. So please. And Frantz Fanon talks about the colonial gaze. Sartre talked about the gaze as an enemy. Or when you look at somebody, you objectify the person. You make the person into a thing, an object. And that's the gaze of, for example, the racist, or the person who wants to reduce the other, not to an other, but just to an object. And here you have, for example, interesting idea of Frantz Fanon, because he said the concept of colonial gaze as an internationalization of the gaze of the other as a self-oppressive othering of the self. So what does this mean? The adoption of the stereotypes of the colonizer makes the colonized a tragic subject. Because in this, as you see in the citations, the gaze that the colonized subject casts at the colonized sector is a look of lust, a look of envy, dreams of possession, every type of possession, of sitting at the colonist's table and sleeping in his bed, preferably with his wife. The colonized man becomes an envious man. And what does this mean for NTA? The problem of oppression leads the oppressed to want to go out of the original culture to join the world culture without respecting oneself as what one really is, because one does not receive recognition. So this is the play of these concepts of the gaze, and we could say, is there similarities in the oppression linked to the nation-state minority relation? So the minority, in order to survive, follows the gaze of the oppressor. So and this leads to this. I'm not a specialist in these recent theories of post-colonialism and intersectionality, but I think it's interesting what this approach can help us to understand the challenges for developing an ethics of hospitality. You can say that this approach promotes a critical, theoretical, and methodological foundation for researching theory and practice of minorities' linguistic, educational, and cultural rights. So here you see all the kinds of oppressions that a culture can be subjected to in a world culture. Yes? And I think if we then look at the so-called hypermodernity that we live today, we are in at different levels. We have local cultures that want to survive as cultures. At the same time, we have the hypermodernity that we live in the modern city. But then, of course, it becomes even more complicated, because in the modern city, you had the diversity of cultures following this one world. So you have, again, a kind of bricolage. But for many minorities, the processes of modernity and modernizations by nation state has been established as a contribution to the loss of tradition and independence by the minority populations. If you use Frantz Fanon, we all want to be hypermodern. And this means that we, in a sense, destroy our traditional cultures because we are following the gaze of the hypermodern. So the next slide. I'm not so far from being finished. So of course, I think in terms of post-colonial and intersectionality theory, it is the past patternist dominance of classes based on presuppositions with regard to sex, race, and class that determine the power structures and normative frameworks that challenge minorities' linguistic, cultural, educational, and cultural rights. So you have this problem of the how to protect these rights. And one more. So you can say that the challenges, assimilation and integration, are here proposed as normative constructs that eliminates the autonomy of minority and integrates them into the dominant structures of the nation state. But how do you do this with a balance? And one more slide. So you have the gaze of the nation state. I have 4 slides back, so I hope you can survive. Now I start doing it too quickly. But following up on Frantz Fanon and the problem of the nation state, here you also have a citation by Simone de Beauvoir. All oppression creates a state of war. This is really a strong statement. But following the post-colonial theory, we can argue that the gaze of the nation states destroys the independence and autonomy of minorities. The gaze of the dominant population frames and stigmatizes the minority as the other with ideological narratives of dominance and superiority. And that's, of course, the challenge, how to deal with this gaze of the nation state that is then internalized by those who are suppressed. And the next one. So I think we could learn a little bit from Frantz Fanon's theory to use it to understand challenges of oppression in NTA. And the next slide. Summing up on this, I started with saying the challenge of the world culture. The second idea was the idea of Derrida and the ethics of hospitality. The third idea was the challenge of post-colonialism and the problem of the gaze, internalized gaze. So this leads me to questions like this. Question number 1, can we combine post-colonial theory with the ethics of hospitality in the development of a theory of cultural difference in the framework of NTA conceptualization? And here, number 2, post-colonial theory help us understanding power theories and concepts of structural domination. But it's not the whole story. I will not stop with such a gloomy picture. So it leads to the next one. The ethics of hospitality gives a framework for understanding the ethics of cultural difference in an open and cosmopolitan perspective. So we need the cosmopolitanism to open up cultures. And this was the third problem, or the fourth problem was this. Nevertheless, does this ignore the question of protection of cultural difference in the reality, hypermodern reality of one world? That there's also the challenge of cosmopolitanism, that it destroys the cultural difference. And we go to the last slide. So with this, could we have an ethics of emancipation looking at NTA? Because if we look at the historical past of imperial and colonial politics, here we need to liberate for NTA arrangements. But then that's one challenge, and the other challenge is this of integrating NTA in contemporary hypermodern global societies. And leads to the third question there, or issue, formulation of narratives of liberalization, ethical difference, and autonomy in order to avoid the violences of oppression. So that was some philosophical reflections of cultural difference in an area of one world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Redentorf, for your impressive presentation. If from the public we have some questions regarding of the presentations of Mr. Professor, please. Please, Mr. Professor.
Yes, but I think the term of hospitality is not only a physical term, it's a spiritual term in the sense that hospitality means if you have a certain, how can you say, I have a certain view of the world. Coming from Denmark, my horizon is a Danish horizon. All I think and do is in a way based on my history and tradition. And the problem can be that I close myself to my own history and tradition. And when I see other people, I see you from the perspective of a Danish person. So I will never see you as you see yourself, because I always see you from my perspective. And hospitality means to open yourself in a way that you can see the other person in a way that is more just to the way the person sees him or herself. So, of course, what does it mean in practice? It means that cultures in a society try to interact where they try to understand the others on their own basis. It's you can call it what you could call a radical hermeneutics, in the sense you really open up to understand the values of the other on the own perspective. For example, if you take religion, it would mean that if I'm a Protestant and I meet, for example, a Catholic, we would have to look at each other's values. In a sense, I would have to go into the whole way the Catholic sees the world, and to my hospitality would be to open for the Catholic worldview, and try to say to myself what would it be to be a Catholic for me, and the opposite should happen. So and it would be the same with, for example, the Muslim perspective in relation to the Catholic perspective or the Protestant perspective. So, but of course, what would happen with this openness? Would it lead to better understanding? But it's important to say spirituality and non-territorial autonomy is of course a spiritual, somewhat a spiritual. It's a question of meaning. It's a question of understanding. The culture of the other is a narrative. A historical expression of values.
Thanks, Jacob. I like this way you always give us a totally new perspective on what we're working on from your philosophy background. I was wondering about this colonized man. If we not can see some, I mean, and this is also the issue about non-territorial autonomy or independence, secession. I think as a historian, we often can see a reversal of national movements from saying, well, we are open, we expect everybody, to suppression again when they gain power. This is the case with Estonia and Latvia, who have changed their position of citizenship from 1991 to 1993. I sometimes hear, the Catalans saying, well, our nationalism is different, and we are inclusive, we accept everybody, and the Scots say the same thing. We have a very inclusive form of nationalism, but that in a way it suddenly turns around again. Would you also agree that there is this feeling like, and I think in post-colonial theory we have also this disappointment of decolonization when actually the colonized men developed new forms of tyranny and dictatorial states in much of Africa.
I think the statement by Frans Fanon actually expresses this. It's why you can put him in this view into the circular dialectics of Sartre, that you have, for example, the Catalans making a revolution, and then 20 years after, a new system of oppression is established in the mirror of the old system. So that's the tragic. And of course, if this idea is that the oppressed want to take over the position of oppressor because the oppressed envies the oppressor, then you end in these reproduction systems where when a new class gets into power, after a while it would just reinstall the structures that were there before. I don't know what to do about it. I think, yes, of course, if you should criticize the Sartre-Fanon system, it's because it's based on violence. They see society as a struggle for freedom, and this goes through war, and they are not so open for the communication, for the cultural encounter through understanding and communication. So that's where the ethics of hospitality comes in, that you should, for example, of course we can also go back to the system where two groups live together and they try to find a democracy for ruling, for a kind of communication about what are our fundamental values and how can we in a society live with a pluralism of fundamental values. Where I respect your value, you respect my values, we find a community that integrates values in that sense. But that needs to move beyond this concept of power struggle. And that is, of course, very difficult. But I think you can, it's a good analytical framework to see what happens.
I have a question as well. So, sir, my question is in the globalization area. I'm in the second year of studying law. So I think this question would be interesting for both my main teachers that are present here. Do you think that we can get all people to live under the same laws in terms of globalization? Can we get all people to live under the same laws? Can we get them to get along?
Of course, that's a challenge of world culture, and of course it's very difficult. But that's where you need to have. I don't believe in a world state, but actually you can see if you take the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. All countries agreed to these Sustainable Development Goals. And these are you can see them as moral values for the future of humanity. But it's maybe the advantage that you can set goals together without a world government, in a sense. But the whole problem of these goals is, of course, do they imply lack of respect for local culture? For example, this is the whole challenge. They have a goal of cultural diversity, for example, and respect of the common heritage of humanity. So when you at the macro level define rules, you need to have a lot of openness to the difference of cultures. But of course, then we get into specific issues. Abortion, for example, and you have all kinds of problems where there's very different values globally. So there, I think the function of the United Nations is mostly to set moral standards, which is very important. And when states bind themselves to these moral standards, in principle, they should follow them in the home government. So you can say at the world level, we have these Sustainable Development Goals as common standards, but you have a lot of states that even though they voted for the goals, have total other principles in practice. But then you can be positive, have an optimistic view and say they actually voted for the goals. So they have to it's somewhat binding for them. So yes.
Thank you.
I have a question as well. So we talked about different barriers about diversity. We talked about religion, culture, traditions. Which barrier do you think is the hardest to break from this?
I think the barrier is that you are so centered on yourself that you are not. It's something of being open to how the other thinks. It's actually when you don't think, you can say you are. For example, you could be take the example of a Protestant. You are so much Protestant that you are not able to understand what it would be to be a Catholic or a Muslim. So you need to go out of the place where you are and see yourself in the place of the other person. And I think that's the most difficult barrier to overcome, that people, you tend to be in your own system, so to say, which means that it's impossible for you to move beyond your own system. And that creates the violence of cultural confrontation, because both of them stay within their own system, and then they consider the other as an enemy. And this can be expressed both as culture, as religion, or through historical values. It can change, I think. Okay. Thank you very much.